G'day YouTube, I'm David and welcome to another episode of Raw History. So whenever world history is discussed in documentaries or textbooks, it's often referring to either Europe or America or maybe the Middle East, but it's rarely ever talking about Australia. Like most of us are familiar-ish with the feather headdresses of the Apache Native Americans or the alleged human sacrifices of the Aztecs, but can you name a single Aboriginal Australian tribe or any one of the 600 languages that they spoke? If you can, that's totally awesome, but I couldn't until I started researching this video, and if you, like me, want to learn more about this really cool but really underrepresented area in history, then stick around, it'll be fun.
We don't need no education.
So in 1606 ACE, that's after the Common Era, a Dutch navigator called Willem Janszoon became the first known European to land on the shores of Australia. Following this discovery of Australia, the entire continent became known as New Holland. Although interestingly, unlike the British, the Dutch never tried to colonise Australia. Speaking of the British, just shy of 170 years later, James Cook came along and mapped the eastern seaboard of Australia, where Sydney is today. James Cook is, of course, most famous for circumnavigating the world and then being eaten alive by cannibals in Hawaii. Before he got cooked up into a meal, though. Cooked. Puns. Hilarious. Jimmy Cook decided that Eastern Australia was the perfect place for a new British colony, and so he came up with a name for it, which was the most stupid name imaginable. So I've said before that historians are bad at naming things, but Captain James Cook, come on, you literally sailed around thousands of miles of uncharted ocean, and the best you could come up with was New South Wales? You took one look at this, and your mind went to this. It's so weirdly specific as well. You see your first ever kangaroo and think, oh no, that's none of this Northern Wales, but it sure does remind me of Swansea. Okay, I kid. And of course, neither Willem Janszoon nor Captain Jimmy Cook actually discovered Australia, as there were up to 1 million people already living there before the European arrival, and their ancestors had been living in Australia for up to 45,000 years. In fact, the Mungo Man, which is this guy, Bam, was the earliest human skeleton found in Australia, and he is thought to have lived about 40,000 years ago. The lesser known but equally important Mungo Lady died at around the same time as the Mungo Man, but she was cremated, and her body is the first evidence of any kind of culture or ritual in Australia 40,000 years ago. So we can't really talk about any particular Aboriginal men and women, but we can talk about Aboriginal societies and culture and religion and the life lived by these first Aussies. So I guess this is less of a walkthrough of Aboriginal history and more of a quick insight into early Australian Aboriginal life. Now, Australia is a big-ass country. And I know we see it on maps, but we often don't fully appreciate just how big of a country it is. It's considerably bigger than Europe, and it's even bigger than Southeast Asia. In fact, Australia is so big that it no longer counts as an island. It's a continental mass, like Africa or the Americas. Australia is about the size of the continental US, except it is much harder to get across the country without 21st century technology. In the west, you've got quite a few massive deserts. You've got tropical rainforests and temperate ones on the east coast. In the south, there's an area of scrubland known as the Marley, and just in case that sounds too easy, you've got a whole host of badass mountains just dotted around the country. And if you're lucky enough to live in Tasmania, then you've got to deal with all of that, plus the fact you're on an isolated little island that's really hard to get off of. The geography of Australia is important because it tells us why there were so many different languages and cultures all around at the same time. Although some local groups did interact with each other, for most of the others, it was impossible to communicate over such large distances, and so we see lots and lots of different societies all living completely independently of each other. This is also super important later in history when the white colonists arrive and Aborigines are discovering Europeans for the first time as well as discovering each other for the first time. Okay, I should just quickly point out that not only does the geography of Australia make it very difficult to get across, but every single living thing in that country wants you dead. Spine-chillingly terrifying snakes, man-eating crocodiles, killer stingrays, jellyfish that are basically made out of poison. octopuses that are also basically made out of poison, scorpions that are also basically made out of poison, sharks that aren't made out of poison, but they don't frickin' need to be. Over 1,000 species of poisonous plants, a paralyzing tick, allegedly baby-eating dingoes, the super-aggressive bull ant, a predatory snail that has enough poison to kill 15 people with just one jab, and yeah, also spiders that are straight up the stuff nightmares are made of. I actually feel like I have to give a warning before I put up a picture of one of these 8-legged demons, so if you have a real fear of spiders, maybe skip forward a few seconds. And this is not to mention all the cute and cuddly animals like kangaroos and koalas that are deceptively adorable, except that they too want to kill you. Now, none of this is actually history, but it's all good stuff to be aware of before we get into the stories of the people that actually lived in this delightful part of the world. I've already said that there's not one type of Aboriginal society, but there are a few things that most of the large communities had in common. For example, because of the ridiculously hostile interior of Australia, many of the larger communities were based around the coast, as most of Australia is today. Being on the coast meant that they had access to seafood and a greater variety of edible wildlife, and they didn't have to suffer the extreme climates that were common in the bush. Ways of life still varied greatly across the continent though. For example, the islanders in the Torres Straits, which is the area south of Papua New Guinea and north of northeast Australia, they practiced agriculture and they even domesticated pigs for food. Just a quick side note, other than pigs, which were only domesticated on these small islands, the only animal that was domesticated in Australia was the dingo. The Aborigines of the Torres Straits also hunted dugong and turtles, and they lived a much more seafaring life than any of the other cultures on the mainland. These islanders also had a very unique culture, which included ritual dancing, wearing these very funky looking masks, and they also developed a game with string that's very similar to Cat's Cradle. Cat's Cradle is of course that string game that people played in high school, but I could never do it. Anyway, moving on to the northern territories of the mainland, where there lived a local group called the Alawa. Here's a fun fact about the Alawa language. Whew, that's fun to say. But it's also kind of a sad fact. In 2013, a report showed that there were only 12 people still alive who could speak the language. Anyway, all these different groups in the Northern Territories contributed a lot to Australian history, including the internationally famous boomerang, as well as the Australian instrument the didgeridoo, which is both incredibly cool and very difficult to play. Nice. In southern Australia, there were many more Aboriginal groups, including the Pamank. I've written all of the words down below because there's absolutely no way I'm pronouncing these right. But the Pamank had a rich and detailed mythology, which I can't fully go into right now, but they were one of the many groups that believed in something called Dreamtime. Now, the idea of Dreamtime is an incredibly integral part of Aboriginal societies and beliefs, but it's really hard to explain because we don't really have anything like it in Western civilization. It's kind of a place beyond time and space where all your ancestors kind of exist as one. I guess it's similar-ish to the spirit world in Asian mythology, but also not. It's definitely not heaven though. It's not a place where you go when you die, it's a place where the spirits live which you can access at times when you're alive. I told you it was kind of complicated. And to make it even more complicated, Dreamtime can also refer to the time before creation, where spirits wandered the earth and these creator beings wandered along things called songlines, which were paths along the ground and also in the sky, in which the creators walked. The locations of these songlines, which were very much believed to be physical things, were recorded in rituals and in, confusingly, the lines of songs, and it was believed that an Aborigine who was very in touch with the spirits or their spiritual side could navigate through the outback just by reciting these songs and rituals, with the aid of the spirits, of course. Now, Australian Aborigines were animists, which means they didn't necessarily celebrate a pantheon of gods, such as the ancient Greeks or the ancient Romans did, but instead they worshipped the spirits that were within everything. So if you imagine a sacred tree spirit or a river spirit that lived within local trees and rivers, and it was these that they prayed to. However, for many Australian Aborigines, the most sacred of these spirits was Alt Jira, And he had many other names, including Mura Mura and Chukurpa. But he was the spirit of the Dreamtime. So Altjera, or Mura Mura, or whatever you want to call him, was a creator spirit who supposedly looked like a kangaroo, except he had the feet of an emu. And he created the earth and then retired to the skies to be with his wife and daughters, who had the feet of dogs? Now that sounds weird, but it's no more weird than the idea of a jolly fat man coming down our chimneys with his flying reindeer every year. And the fact that the most powerful god was the creator god and also the god of Dreamtime really shows us how important Dreamtime was to Aboriginal societies. In fact, information gathered in the Dreamtime was used to create laws and rituals, and it was even believed that the Dreamtime could lead people to the most sacred places. Now, speaking of holy spaces, I know that I said most Indigenous Australians, much like modern Australians, lived around the coasts, but that doesn't mean all of them did. And right in the heart of the Australian outback is the most sacred place in Aboriginal culture, and it's located almost bang in the middle of the country. This is Uluru, which was later renamed Ayers Rock by Europeans, and it is the most famous natural landmark in all of Australia. Well, after the Great Barrier Reef, I guess. But Uluru is of major importance to the Arnangu people, who lived way out in the desert, completely isolated, just so they could be close to their sacred rock. Uluru is also located fairly close to the lesser known, but still significantly sacred, Katajuta, or as the Europeans renamed it, Mount Olga. Both of these rock formations have an incredible amount of mystery and mythology and legend within them, and we can still see evidence of their revered nature carved into the rocks to this day. So I just want to finish up by talking about the legend of Uluru, or Ayers Rock. In Arnangu mythology, it's believed that Uluru was the first thing ever created by the gods. They believed that the world was once a never-ending desert inhabited by creator beings known as the Waparicha. The Waparicha inhabited this desert in the form of trees or animals or rocks, creating as they went. With Uluru being the first thing ever made, it was believed that the oldest and most powerful of these spirits still inhabited the rock and gave it its power, and this explains why it was so sacred. There were also loads of other great legends about how Uluru came to be. And my personal favourite involves two groups of ancient spirits that were invited to a feast. However, on their way to the feast, these spirits were distracted by some sleepy, beautiful lizard women. That is a direct quote. And so they were very late to the party. In response to their guests' tardiness, the hosts, as any of us would do, stuffed the essence of pure evil into a slab of mud, which then came to life in the form of a dingo. These dingoes then waged a war against the spirits, in which everybody was killed. The earth itself was so upset by this battle that it rose up to mark the graves of all the fallen spirits and became Uluru. Okay, now I am no geologist, but I'm pretty sure this is an example of mythology and not actual fact. But it's still a really interesting insight into the Aboriginal Australian culture, which is so often forgotten by Western historians. So in 1985, the Australian government finally gave Uluru back to the Arnangu people. But part of the agreement was that it would be jointly owned between the Arnangu and the National Park Service for the next 99 years. And this has created a weird contradiction. On the one hand, we have Ayers Rock, which is one of Australia's most famous landmarks and a hugely popular tourist destination. Every year, thousands of people from around the world come to photograph Ayers Rock and climb it. But just because you can doesn't necessarily mean you should. Because, on the other hand, Uluru is still a hugely significant place for Aboriginal Australians, and it's a place that's steeped in ancient mystery. Although it is legal to climb Ayers Rock, the local peoples ask that you don't, because it's a sign of major disrespect, as is taking photographs, which has always been a taboo in Aboriginal culture. Although when we think of Australia, we often think of these things, it shouldn't be forgotten that for tens of thousands of years, this was Australia. And that's all I have time for, unfortunately. But please keep the discussion going in the comments section below. And if you've enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit like and hit subscribe to make sure you don't miss any more future raw history videos. And my head scratcher of the week is, If someone ever spelt a word wrong whilst they were writing the dictionary, how would we know? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.